You know those channels your colleagues keep bragging about? The ones getting all the credit? Yeah, they might be doing squat. Attribution makes every channel look like a hero, even when it's a zero. Incremental tells you who's actually doing the work. It's like a lie detector for your marketing budget. Start using Incremental today. Get your demo at incremental.com. That's INCRMNTAL.com. Mention that you came through the Mobile Dev Memo podcast for a special 15% discount for the first 6 months.
The problem is that the distinction needs to be drawn between the competence of the economists and the correctness of their analysis.
Welcome to the Mobile Dev Memo podcast. I'm your host, Eric Seufert, and I'm joined again by Peter Stuart. Peter, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
I had you on 6 months ago in December. We talked about a topic that I find very fascinating, which is the application of AI to the news and media publishing space. You gave us a really good overview of what was happening in that space. My sense is a lot has changed in that 6 months. I think when we first spoke, you had just launched your publishing platform, Velora. You had maybe encountered a sort of like a strand of negative sentiment about the application of AI to publishing. Please introduce yourself to the audience or those who didn't hear the first podcast, and then walk me through what's changed in the world of publishing in terms of the application of AI and the perceived acceptability of using AI in the publishing workflow since we last spoke.
Yeah. No, happy to chat about that. Yeah, once again, thanks for having me on. So I'm Peter. I'm the co-founder of Velora, along with my technical co-founder, Danny Bellion. And I come from a background of having been a cycling journalist since I was 21 years old. Before that, as a general journalist. And before that, a student journalist with Eric. And yeah, I kind of went through the heydays of magazines. And then latterly, my last role was as the editor of Cycling News, which is the world's biggest cycling website. About a year ago, I came up with a kind of loose idea of like developing something that was going to be more AI native as a concept from publishing. And sort of in conversation with Danny, who I met at a barbecue, having not spoken to him for like 6 years or something, we got chatting and we decided to like give it a go, simultaneously quit our jobs, suicide pact, and go for launching this platform. As you mentioned, it was originally a cycling website, and it is still a cycling website, but our focus is always on developing a platform behind it that would ultimately take the lift out of modern journalism and modern publishing. A large part of that has actually just been the decomposition of the writing process and the publishing process. So Danny, having not been in the publishing background, sort of looked at what I did day to day and sort of looked at where he thought an agent or an AI tool could do the job better, or at least augment the job substantially. So where we started with the cycling publication, we quickly kind of pivoted to producing this as like a public-facing platform that other publishers could use. And yeah, since we chatted, we have, kind of about a dozen different publishers using the platform, like on a kind of license basis across totally different sectors. And we're just trying to like help more publishers kind of be able to use effectively what is a suite of different AI tools in a very kind of tight orchestration to take the heavy lift out of their publishing workflow. Sometimes that's just basic stuff like tracking news visibility. Sometimes that's kind of like more involved in terms of the CMS uploading, finding images. Sometimes it is extending through to like AI drafting articles and sort of like doing some sort of more automated content. But key to it has always been like the kind of like visibility element, the research element, and the verification element, and the CMS kind of manual uploading agentic process, which have been a help for anyone in publishing, regardless of their view on AI writing or AI drafting.
And so what's happened in the kind of news and media publishing space with respect to, the adoption of AI in the 6 months since we spoke last?
Yeah, so I think when we last spoke, it was probably when there'd been quite a lot of stuff published about the kind of quite slow uptake of AI in journalism across the UK, certainly. I think the Reuters had a stat that about 20% of journalists had never used an AI tool in any journalistic task at all. And, only sort of about a quarter were using it on a daily basis, which a large part of that was just AI transcription tools like Otter and things. Since then, there's been sort of like some more public kind of embracing of AI tools. Like, you have a large, quite high profile partnership between News UK and Symbolic, which is an AI kind of editorial suite. And outside of the UK, we've certainly had other countries that have had more kind of fundamental AI infrastructure become part of their workflow with multiple agent-generated news with sort of almost effectively totally automated local news processes or news production. But in the UK, I think probably, as with the US, a lot of the kind of development's been slightly hamstrung by a lot of sort of quite high profile kind of embarrassing cases of, AI being misused or like causing editorial errors. And that's where kind of most of the news has hovered. So I think most AI use is still quite discreet. And speaking to trainers in the AI space, like while I think more companies are looking at ways to use AI, most companies are still quite early in their process of like currently still getting to terms with like a Claude kind of subscription and Claude co-work tools and Gemini kind of basic chatbots. We haven't seen like the kind of full agentic process go into many publications, and certainly not in a public way.
I think for the most part, any major news publication now has an LLM generated summary at the top. And, I don't think readers, consumers, object to that. I think, in fact, people probably find it really helpful. I started including that in the posts I send by email just because I think it's important for people to get a sense of like what this 1,000 words is about before they kind of commit to it, right? And so if you just kind of read a 2-sentence summary that I think is pretty obviously generated by LLM, maybe it gives you a sense of whether this is worth your time or not. And I think people find that helpful. But where's that boundary, right? Like, where does it go from like, this is a helpful perk that you're providing to me versus like, oh, you've deceived me and you're making me read slop? Like, where do you draw the line? Because the summary, I think, if we just, maybe just kind of accept that everyone views that as a useful tool and that's like an acceptable use case, to like writing the full article with an LLM probably wouldn't be seen in the same light. Where's the line? Like, if I had whole paragraphs that were LLM generated, or like where do you think you would draw a line there on just on the output side of things?
I think what you see with lots of publications is they have sort of developed language that will state, maybe if an AI is used to create a substantial part of the article, we will make it transparent. And that's kind of the language you might see with, say, like The Guardian or the BBC. I think the BBC might specifically say that writing is not allowed or research is not allowed with AI tools, basically, to be even more clear cut. But I think there's quite like a furry line when you say like AI is used for any part of the writing process versus AI is like maybe generating articles quasi-autonomously. To my mind, it gets like super cynical and kind of a bit distasteful when something is positioned as, say, commentary or opinion and it's clearly AI generated, because I think that's when you feel as a reader like, well, have you really like articulated this yourself, or is it just the result of 2 prompts or even 1 prompt? Be like, write me a hot take. I think it's really important to consider how that's different to, say, like something that might be like a financial write-up of a quarterly report. And at that point, you're like, well, really all you're trying to do is you might have a huge document that's emailed to you in press release form or an SEC filing, and you're just trying to delineate the key information for your audience. And at that point, I'd say, well, if you have a robust pipeline in place, and this is my view, and you have verification in place and the information is correct, it doesn't really make a difference in my perspective if that's AI written or human written from scratch, because the core thing is it's an informational journey for the reader. And if they've sort of found that that has been fulfilled appropriately, then I think AI use or no AI use isn't really a problem. I think generally, like, the amount of AI written content on the internet is actually far, far more than most people appreciate. Like, even people like The Guardian, prestigious publications, they get caught out with like, Pangam type like screenshots of saying, your sports writers have been using 100% AI generated content for the last like 6 columns they've published. And they haven't often been able to rebuff that in a very efficient or like kind of robust way, because most publications don't have control over what every single writer is doing all the time. And there's always the argument, the AI detector is not 100% reliable or what have you. So it's not like a fair jury. In terms of like the substrate that sits below, kind of substrate's probably the wrong word, in terms of the layer that sits below, like the nationals and the prestigious titles, I'd say AI generated copy is already effectively like ubiquitous. Like, and you're thinking about all the trade magazines, all the BTP publications, all the kind of the individual site owners that exist there. A lot of these people are, financially sensible and responsible for their output and their income, and they're naturally going to look at what is the most efficient way to get content out to a level which their audience expects. There's also like, I think I never expected to like started working in this field, but the amount of offshoring, that's kind of a combination of offshoring and AI use, is also super, super common across lots and lots of sectors. You might have financial or like showbiz or, sporting titles that have teams in the Philippines or India or somewhere that are using kind of ChatGPT to mass produce content. A lot of this gets penalized by Google from time to time, but lots of it doesn't if the domain is established and has lots of authority. So yeah, the actual broad ecosystem of how AI is used, I think, has changed substantially. My expectation now with most publications, when I see content, is definitely if it has regular output of quite commodity content, is that AI has played a part in the creation of lots of the copy. Whether that's obviously detectable is probably more of a technical question than it is ethical, because people that use AI a lot are probably getting better and better at disguising the kind of the obvious AI-isms. And that kind of becomes, to me, the most insulting bit when someone's not even tried to cover up the fact that it's like, that's not weakness, it's, fragility or something. And it's like, come on, this is freaking obviously ChatGPT talking, get rid of that. But so you kind of end up more resentful of the person's like technical gap and not thinking like, why didn't you cover this up? All that say, no, I'm not necessarily promoting this as like a good outcome. Like the machine written kind of like ecosystem of publishing is kind of scary in a way, but we have to be honest that people aren't going to make life difficult for themselves. If you have basically the world's most efficient intern sitting right next to you, willing to do all your writing for free, you're not going to labor through yourself and do it. If you've got to pay, a mortgage to pay and you're conscious of hits and time and whatnot. So I think in the broadest term, that has changed quite a lot across the whole ecosystem of publishing. Where that sits for like big publishers, I'm not sure. But truth be told, while I was saying before that, they've got AI tools in place and are trying to work on that, what I hear from like people that are trainers in the space is that a lot of them, because they've had such hostility and such fear amongst the staff, they still are maybe like a year, 2 years behind a lot of what other sectors might be at. So they're now currently getting into like using Claude Cowork or setting up like, an agent or something, but they're not quite where other industries maybe. You were saying, even say in marketing, I think a lot of marketing teams have got kind of quite efficient kind of like content automation pipelines in place already. It's kind of maybe a bit of a given, and increasingly even from the SEO teams that used to be very anti-AI, they'll accept the assumption that AI has played quite a big part in writing because it's just naturally efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. Where does the audience delineate like acceptable use is probably what ultimately is going to define what acceptable use is, and not just these kind of like legacy media organizations trying to maintain like the status quo, because it's just like you said, I mean, it's just not going to be economical. But like I think because I was writing to this company called Bending Spoons, filed for an IPO yesterday, and so I was writing up the F1, which is like the foreign equivalent of an S1. It's their filing document, and like historically, I would have just read that whole thing and it'd be like, that's 100 pages and like, okay, that's going to take 2 hours. But now I just feed it to ChatGPT and I have a list of questions and tell me where I can find this information. But it also, if it's giving me just some, call it a 2-sentence paragraph that summarizes the growth, there's no discernible difference between what I would have written and what it wrote. It's just a bunch of numbers concatenated with like ands and commas. Like it's really, there's no, you wouldn't be able to tell. And like I said, for that purpose, it's like, okay, if I copy, I don't remember if I did. I try not to have anything make it into my articles that is purely machine written. But like if I copied and pasted that, I don't think it's not a violation of trust on the part of the reader. Now that's not analysis. That's just reporting numbers, right? Reporting metrics, right? But what have you heard? Like, what is the range of attitudes across big media organizations? Does it tend to map by size? Like BBC says absolutely not, and then some small blog says we just don't care. Like, what is the range of attitudes, and how does that map to like the size or the prestige or the the age of the organization?
I think really big organizations haven't changed particularly quickly, and that's probably not to do with ethics as much as to do with just like the inertia of a very large business and the way it operates. Like you have the BBC has thousands and thousands of journalists, the Times has hundreds. Those people have their own workflows on their own desks, and telling them to switch to something else is going to be really hard at the best of times, and I think quite commonly, these big organizations might roll out a Gemini, license, and then uptake's absolutely tiny. I'm actually headed to a conference next week from publishing across Europe, and it'd be interesting to see there more direct on the ground information. But I think you have a scene where like in the Nordic countries or Scandinavia or even kind of Belgium, you have much more embracing of like AI tools and AI like agentic processes, like Mediahus, which is like a big publisher that owns like 100 different publications, including nationals. They have a whole like agentic news workflow that they're very open about. Like, I don't know what the bylines look like on that. I don't know whether it is like sort of, subsequently, like attached to someone's line or it's transparently kind of machine written. I think generally like places in the UK, that do have started to go down the kind of AI drafting route are probably not super vocal about it. And I think that problem with that is that I think trust kind of falls through the floor when someone knows something is AI written. I think the assumption is that, much like I said at the beginning, that if someone's using AI, it's a total laziness play. It's not to do with actually trying to improve the content or be more efficient. And there's lots of, studies in this that trust of AI media is like super low. But worth qualifying that stuff that trust of media generally is also actually super low. So people are naturally not going to trust AI in me if they don't trust media anyway. So I think there's a big range of like kind of full kind of like manual written kind of policies that will be very carefully adhered to, and then people that are experimenting a bit more boldly. A lot of it's going to be like on a very basic level, a kind of economic cost per article thesis. Like if you have the Times, the Sunday Times, the Economist, they don't publish a huge amount of articles for the staff they have. They've got like a very expensive subscription base. Their readers probably expect a large investment. A writer has always spent 1 or 2 days, maybe more, writing an article. By comparison, you might have digital writers at lots of publications that might have to do 10 plus stories a day. And then at that point, you're like, well, if the story was kind of commodity content anyway, it doesn't really change anything if it's machine written. And so it's not surprising when a lot of those titles will flip to a machine written kind of model. But I'd expect that, the more prestigious titles, the FTs, the Times, the BBC will continue to sort of have like a very rigorous copy is human written. Whether that actually changes anything, or actually makes the experience better for the reader, I kind of question. And, some of these people like the FT, like, certainly strict policies, they have actually offered like totally AI generated content as a service. That's like Newscast that was done a few years ago using like a third party AI kind of newswire service called Noah Wire. Yeah, I don't think that's ever made it to like consumer readers, but it was envisaged as like a B2B service. Again, a lot of that stuff, like it probably has been experimented with quite early when the models were still not really quite up to it. But I think there's definitely been a sea change. Like, when you have like Opus 4.6, probably the moment I'd say that stuff jumped forward quite dramatically in terms of capability with writing. And 4.8, like the actual models now are like super capable. And now it's not a question of like quality, I don't think, on the writing front. It's really just about kind of ethics and accountability.
Plenty of mobile growth strategies are still built on broken journeys and incomplete data, and it's costing brands big time. Branch fixes that. It's your AI-powered MMP that unifies your links, measurement, and user experience across every channel to successfully acquire, retain, and engage your app users without wasting spend. Learn more at branch.io. And while you're there, check out Branch's AI Search and Discovery Report, covering insights from more than 300 marketing, growth, and digital leaders on how they're responding to the rise of AI search. I want to move on from the output part of the discussion because I think it's the more superficial topic within this conversation. But how do you view that like accountability piece? Because I mean, my sense is like you could view the brand or just the association of the publication with, rigorous journalism, exhaustive fact checking, unbiasedness. You could view that kind of brand association as a license to embrace this because it's like you sort of give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll embrace it responsibly, right? And so it's actually interesting that you said that the Northern European countries are embracing, the use of AI in news, and because they tend to be, I think, a little bit more restrictive with anything that has to do with like labor and workers' rights and stuff. But if you have this reputation, if you're the Walter Cronkite, sort of halo effect, then you'd think that your readers might give them more leeway to introduce this because it's like, well, I trust that they're using this, but they're also validating it, verifying it. They're using it in ways that are aligned with their sort of brand image, and so I'm going to accept it from them, but like from another publication, I might not, just because they don't have that same level of trust. Do you think that's roughly right? A good way to look at it?
Yeah, to be honest, I think my view on this stuff is that I think the level of trust is very high with those brands. Also, the level of skepticism. Like now, I don't know if you've noticed, but like if there's like a commonly shared LinkedIn post about like some headline in a newspaper being like all wrong, or like it's always like, look, AI messed up again. And it's like, well, probably not actually. If someone miswrote a headline, I don't think AI would do that. It's quite good at doing that sort of stuff.
Right.
Probably just some sub editor that wasn't paying attention. You get the odd like end of a newspaper. It's a newspaper in India that had like for the next question, let me know if I can help out by putting this in an email.
Yeah.
And that stuff happens quite a lot. And then you have like more high profile like mess ups, like you had the kind of New York Times when they had an AI generated kind of summary was attributed as a quote, or you had a book review plagiarized from The Guardian, and you had Ars Technica had that huge issue with like AI generated quotes as well. There was a whole like list of issues. And I think what ultimately, in my view, happens is the titles don't have a very clear or like sensible AI policy. Some individuals in that business use AI tools in a very like untechnical unwise way, they have a big scandal and then they totally freeze up and like, we don't use AI at all, it's all human stuff. And it's kind of like that recoiling back just because that fear of like trust is like so strong. I mean, my view of this stuff has always been that I think if you have super robust AI policies that involve actual AI use and really clear traceability. And that's what I don't think there is a lot of kind of like processes in place where you have, okay, here's our research agent, here's where that's checked by a human, here's where a draft might be checked by a human, here's where an edit is checked by a human, here's where an edit is completed by a human, here's like, you know, an n-gram comparison of the edit versus the draft. And you can totally see how much has been changed by the person. I think that would be like a state where you think, okay, well, this seems like it's a robust, auditable kind of process. And I think, I don't know where they're at with it, but the EU has the Transparency Act for AI-generated content. I think will come into effect in August. I haven't checked on it recently, but for that, they actually offer like an exemption of news publishers that have very clear auditing in place. So if they're saying, you know, we clearly see who set the software up to written, which research tool was used, you don't have to disclose and say this is AI-generated content. How that law is going to work in effect, I have no idea, because, you know, how are you going to enforce that across like the whole of news media? So yeah, I think in answer to your question, I think there's like probably a bit of a technical gap where the titles haven't begun aggressively working on an AI kind of like infrastructure that makes sense for them. And also they're faced with so much audience hostility, people just hunting down some sort of a scandal to slip them up to be like, hey, look, the media got it wrong. And, you know, they're using AI for lazy purposes. And, you know, alongside that, you have some super kind of like ill-advised projects where, you know, I think this one publisher in the US had sort of said that they have the right to publish articles that are AI generated with writers bylines with or without their consent, and that's just a kind of crazy management decision where it is totally like obviously going to have a big backlash. I think generally like trust is a complex issue, and I think trust of AI being used well will be super low for brands where there's already a massive public skepticism anyway, which typically is the bigger brands that, you know, are more public.
Right. Yeah. I think about the use of Grok on Twitter, like for instance, right? Like, so it feels like a very effective, and like, let me know if you see this other differently, but like it feels like a very effective way of just combating misinformation, because you just, okay, well, I'm going to use the LLM, which is also has, you know, kind of tool access and can do searches in real time and just validate what people are saying. And like, yeah, there's a lot more AI slop on Twitter now, but you can also use the integrated LLM, which is Grok, to validate what people are saying, and if they're just spouting nonsense, and like that feels like a, you know, so right there you can kind of see the pros and the cons. Like, well, okay, there's a lot of AI slop. Someone just went to ChatGPT and asked for whatever 300 words on some topic, and it's just poorly written and not engaging prose, right? But at the same time, like the benefit of applying LLMs in this environment is I could just fact check stuff almost in real time and call people out and utterly neutralize what they're trying to do, which is spread information, because you could just see the Grok response and then someone attaches a community note. And I think that actually is like a really ingenious technique for slowing the spread of just false information. So like there's right there, it's visible right on Twitter of the dual use, right? Or like the sort of like dual impact.
Yeah, I think that's really, you know, I actually think about that all the time. No joke. It's funny you say that, because I was actually talking to my partner about it today. Yeah, you know, a really interesting specific example of that in action in real time was about 2 weeks ago. There was an article published across the international media, which is about these Thai police officers that had apparently like gone in drag to bust a drug rink, and it was back in this picture of them all in drag at the police station, you know, having like busted loads of like seized loads of drugs, and it was like probably 3 or 4 days of it running until eventually it came out the image was AI generated, and yeah, everyone had to like issue kind of corrections. The thing is that stunned me about that story is that I looked at it and it wasn't actually picked up in the UK press at all that this was the case, but I took the Telegraph's picture that was on their actual website, ran it through SynthID, and SynthID, you know, Greek Gemini's inbuilt AI detection tool, right. SynthID flagged that it was an AI generated image based on the SynthID pattern, and you're like, well, that's totally bewildering that nobody throughout this whole news cycle thought to just put it into Gemini to be like, hey, is this AI? That tool is free, you know, anyone can do that. And lots of AI generated content, you know, won't have the SynthID because it might be done from other AI image generation tools. But the most common one is Gemini or ChatGPT, and ChatGPT also now has the SynthID in it.
Right.
You're like, you could easily use AI to actually combat misinformation, but there's not necessarily the processes in place to do that. And that's one element I think is really interesting, that people sort of think AI disinformation, but actually AI also is a solution to that, even that AI kind of disseminated disinformation. And then I think the point about like AI tools, like I kind of think being used to combat disinformation is super interesting because while we on one hand talk about like the lack of trust in AI generated content, yeah, I constantly see, as you say, like growth is true on Twitter. And, I think people, go to ChatGPT, check everything. Like, I check people are going to pile on, but I check medical stuff on ChatGPT, and I feel confident to be like, well, I'm an intelligent human on top of this. So if it says, go to hospital, I probably need to use that information in relevance to like what I know about the world to be like, okay, that's fair advice. Versus on Google, typically medical stuff is just kind of terrifying because you're like, well, here's an info page about having some awful terminal disease that might have the symptom. So yeah, I think AI is super effective actually, like providing information and like being grounded and also weirdly trusted by seemingly all sides, because everyone from all spectrums seems to be like, I don't think they'd at the Guardian, someone who's like a Republican wouldn't be like, at Guardian, is this story true? They just innately just trust
right
but that's but in a way that I don't understand, everyone seems to just align themselves to believing what like an AI tool will say. And my best guess is that there's no like implicit agenda within an AI tool that's just existing to kind of like react to the questions you provide it. So you don't feel like it's trying to imprint on you. And it might be like, I'm sure there's lots of studies into the kind of like right or left wing like traces within answers and stuff, or but ultimately people seem to just be happy that it's responding to them in the way they address it, which probably will mold to whatever kind of political ideology you have. Or maybe typically I think it does tend to mediate against any extreme. Like if you're a very left-wing person, ChatGPT may push you more right, more center, and the same with right wing. But generally I think it engages you on your level, which I think is why people seem to have this trust that they can just engage in dialogue in a way that doesn't work with the wider kind of news media, where I think you constantly really have to align yourself to one political way of thinking to agree with one publication's output. And that's probably just to do with the fact that ultimately, and this is me getting a bit philosophical, so excuse me a second, but ultimately the news is ambient and huge. It's all happening all the time. And I definitely now more than ever, newspapers report on what Donald Trump said on Truth Social, and that will be the main component of a story. They don't need to spend as much time, being at a press conference to get a quote. Stuff is just happening all around us. So newspapers increasingly have to choose their segment of reality along a certain polemic of the way they want to communicate that. And I think in the world of AI, increasingly, I think firstly, platforms are already kind of distributing that information naturally in a way that is kind of suited to its audience, like TikTok or Instagram may serve reels that provide news to people in a way that's very different to historic news production. But I think AI tools offer a layer on top of that where they can totally interpret kind of everything that's going on and produce a really useful answer and explain it to somebody that's quite like reassuring in real time. So I think those things just make an AI tool quite trustworthy for the general population. I think that's going to be more and more the case. But the problem is, when you think about it on a sort of, theoretical level, if people are using an AI tool to validate a journalist perspective, the kind of game is totally inverted, because the person that's trusted to be the kind of source of information is now being corrected by the AI tool, which is kind of madness. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that. A long answer, apologies.
Well, yeah, I guess my point was more just is this just allows us to have a better sense of like whether we can trust the underlying kind of, call it factual scaffolding of things that are reported, right? So like to your point, like I you've got to trust that the tool itself is unbiased, right? So like, no one's going to at Guardian or like, at Teen Vogue. Is it true that, I don't know, take your pick. But like, if it was trained on Teen Vogue's corpus, I don't know that I would consider that to be an unbiased fact checker. But assuming you do trust it, like if I'm seeing right, I could, it's much easier to do fact checking now. I don't have to go to like a team of people that are going to comb over each sentence and like what, and go search where. Because in a lot of cases, like there might not be a discrete source of like to validate some piece of information. But if I'm seeing something that's not, no, I'm not talking about opinion pieces, but if I'm just seeing something that's written as news, I'm assuming that if I can assume now that they used an LLM-based fact checker to validate what was written, it's probably trustworthy, or at least it hews to the preponderance of information that exists on that topic, right? Like, and so that should make me maybe give me more trust in the news that I read, right? And if I'm assuming that these tools are applied to the output, not generated the output, but it's just applied to it as some sort of filter, and there's just more accessibility of fact checking, then maybe I have a better sense of trust for everything that I read, going from the biggest publication down to someone's Substack.
Yeah, that's actually, I think I was thinking about that today. And I think there's a sense that like, okay, you've got AI not trustworthy, human trustworthy, but obviously people are not trustworthy. Like, you have to assume that an editor, and at my time as an editor, like the amount of copy that came across my desk, like was huge. I didn't have time to like check, okay, let me go and Google that this city actually is in Italy or whatever. Like, I'd just be like, cool, well, that looks fine. The journalists presumably know what they're talking about. So like, no spelling mistakes, let's go. Don't quote me on that, but obviously you check the stuff that's high stakes, but like, you don't have like a kind of constant like rolling fact checker.
Right.
But as technology changes, I think in most sectors, you have an expectation that there's like, if a tool is available and it's capable, there begins to become a dynamic where not using it becomes the negligent thing. Like, if it refused to use a CT scanner or didn't do X-rays, I just don't believe in that. I'm an old school, orthopedic surgeon. It'd be like, no, what? Like, no, like use the freaking technology. Like, otherwise, if something goes wrong, then that's suddenly like a culpability issue for you. And I feel like it's very feasible that if this is not already the case, that could become the case with sort of like journalistic publishing work, because you've got like a grounded search on Google Gemini Pro or something, like just giving examples, one that we use for one step of our verification. It is incredibly capable at returning information, and not just information that is like based on training data. It will find search-based validated information in real time and be like, okay, this 100% is true based on this source, or this actual primary evidence based on what someone said on X or something. And like there are gaps there, and you sometimes have hallucinations kind of cascade through news media. But even then, there's points where you could be like, well, then develop an anti-hallucination validator to go find the original source. And there's like steps that you're like, you can actually like kind of introduce tiers of validation and verification that would be totally impossible for any sort of news team unless they had a crazy budget of hundreds and hundreds of heads. So in that sense, I feel that AI can and will ultimately make stuff like a higher bar of like verification and truth when it's like used in a sort of intelligent and like well deployed way.
Right, and to your point, you might even want to disclose the fact that you didn't use it, right? And again, like not the Teen Vogue fact checker LLM.
They're coming for you. Their legal team is super litigious. How dare you defend Teen Vogue?
or the Breitbart at Breitbart LLM fact checker. But like, if you didn't use any sort of LLM based fact checking, you might want to disclose that like no LLM was used to fact check this article. Then I would probably be less. I would be more skeptical of what was written there, like that it wasn't at least validated against the common terminology or like common referenced metrics. If it was using some source that was seen to be biased in some way and that wasn't flagged, like that, to me, I would want to know that, like, because I just assume now, and maybe it's an invalid assumption, but I assume that anything I'm reading on the internet has at least gone through a pass, right? Like I do it, like give me spell check and grammar check at a minimum. But like just and so like again, I just do think that the widespread availability of these tools should fortify a lot of the stuff that we read. What I do is I've got one of my prompts that I take an article through before especially if it's like a more controversial topic. I read this adversarially. Tell me the top 5 criticisms that someone would have against this if they were very hostile to the ideas that I'm articulating here. And like, that's really helpful because it helps to maybe soften some of the edges or like take to sort of like deflate some of the more tendentious, things, and like just make it less likely that someone's going to explode when they read it. And I would imagine that you just see that effect. And so like, I don't think that that's highlighted as a benefit, like the widespread availability, because again, people focus on the output, but if you focus on just these tools as a layer that the human written output passes through to improve them, I don't think anybody could argue that that is a benefit.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny because the Velora platform, like, we have like a whole pipeline of, from like article idea to verified, final like CMS ready content. But we have actually developed a whole separate pathway, which is like manual writing. And in that pathway, you just write into our platform. But as you go, you can select text and you can say, challenge this, or find a new angle, or fact check it. And it does that against research document that exists against the topic. And that has been super interesting because I'm like, I don't think at any point you can say you have an objection to that in terms of like AI interfering with the process, because you can take or leave the advice. You can be like, cool, that was your perspective, I'm going to ignore that. But typically it's super effective at being like, you only have your own perspective in writing. It is effectively someone else, like a live real-time editor, saying, that doesn't really make sense, does it? Or like, don't you think that people are going to question whether that's like a valid argument in light of this? And I find that's really super helpful as I'm writing stuff like more like analysis type stuff, to be like, okay, highlight this, challenge this, angle this. And I feel like that this could become the standard way to ultimately see writing reach a new level of quality. And I think that people might be squirming hearing that, but I think we think about AI tools like helping coding or whatever, like Claude Code or coding agents that really accelerate, and in a way that most people no longer have an objection to. No one's saying, "Oh, Claude Code just creates slop." It's like, well, most of the internet now is like being built with Claude Code, and I think writing could be the same. I think as the technology develops, I think we'll see tools that actually augment writing in a really positive way and actually lead to writing being better, because you're giving people that might not have had the experience of having like an editor or like someone else's feedback, suddenly having an LLM tool to say, this could be a bit better. Have you thought about that? And most seasoned writers have had that in human form. They've had someone go through and say, like, you need to tighten up your writing, we need to knock the edges off this. And that's like a really key part, I think, of maturing as a writer. And I don't know many people that wouldn't have had that at some point in their careers that have suddenly gone on to be like, very, very accomplished or, technically strong writers. So I think that's why it's a real positive. Obviously, the flip side is that, when one editor, and this is getting a bit political, one editor is very kind of like edit heavy at a title, everyone's content tends to conform to that person's writing. And I think that the same thing can happen with ChatGPT. If the whole world is using ChatGPT as their de facto editor, then everyone's writing will naturally sort of trend towards what ChatGPT inherently thinks is good. But, I think then that there are flaws there, and there are risks, but I think there's still a lot of scope for originality and, for just treating an LLM as like a really healthy adversarial or like supporting writing assistant or co-writer.
Yeah, right. And I'm not talking about like give me advice on the pros. I'm talking about like fact check this and give me a sense of like what the holes are in it. Mobile game developers no longer need to pay up to 30% in major app store fees. With Xsola Web Shop, you can create a direct storefront, cut fees down to as low as 5%, and keep players engaged with bundles, rewards, and analytics. Start today at xsola.com. That's xsolla.com, or use the link in the episode show notes. I want to talk about the Velora platform because I think that, to me, like what you've built is, I think, like if you just kind of like had a one-liner, like an elevator pitch for the platform, like a kind of layman would probably say, "Oh, you're going to help people. You're going to contribute to more AI output on the internet," and like that's absolutely not what the Velora platform is. I mean, you gave me access and I've used it. I want to talk about that because I think what I'm impressed by with the Velora is the capabilities with respect to finding, processing, classifying, sorting, ranking news and ideas as a tool, right? And that to me is what an LLM is truly good at. An LLM does next token prediction and it's generative, it generates text. But I think a lot of the sort of a misunderstood value is just doing all those things, classifying, ranking, sorting, like, summarizing, that kind of stuff is the real value to me. And talk to me about how the Velora platform is used as a publishing tool, because I think that's the piece that I think people don't appreciate about the power of AI in publishing. And we talked about one piece just now is like fact checking, right? But talk to me about the whole suite, like the whole sort of like end-to-end use case of this stuff that has nothing to do with generating text.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think you have to accept that, like, ultimately, whenever you think about AI tools, like, you can take objections to them and say, I don't like the idea of this. I don't, think it's trustworthy for writing copy. It's all totally fine. But there's some things you can't debate that an AI tool is better at. And one of those things is certainly taking a huge amount of information and quickly processing it and understanding it in a very like top line way. So, news discovery in terms of like signals and understanding of what is interesting to your audience, you can ingest like 1,000 sources every hour, and an AI, typically a person might scroll their competitors and their beat, might look at social posts, but they might have 30 signals or sources. An AI can look at thousands and it will sort in a intelligent way. This is what is relevant to you at this particular moment. These are the most kind of high interest topics for you to pursue as a starting point. In my mind, there's just no competition there. Like, there's a value in someone looking through the whole kind of news of the picture, but you can't possibly do it as well as an AI tool. Now, another element you can't do as well, or perhaps you need to do in sort of symphony, is kind of research. And I think like definitely there's kind of like there's value in doing your own research, but as you said, you can't look through like dozens and dozens of sources, hundreds of pages of PDFs in 5 minutes. Like, it's not something that a human being is able to do. Like, if you had enough time and resource, maybe, but ultimately there's a limitation that you simply cannot scope this much information. You cannot draw so much research together. You can't understand the picture widely like that. So that is something that I think an AI tool, again, is fundamentally better at in symphony with a person. Then, like, at the other end, The pure manual processes, so, well, yeah, finding an image that's relevant, that's like a long personal, like train time thing. Populating fields in a CMS, that is a very laborious kind of menial task that people have historically done. CMSs have been built because people have to do them, have to populate these fields. They have to say, here's a title field, here's a subhead field. When you really think about it, that doesn't really need to have any human interface. If an agent or an AI tool can understand that that's where that copy needs to go, we only created a complex infrastructure to enable someone to put it there because there's no other way of taking copy from here and putting it there. Like when an AI can do it, you just need to abstract that step entirely away from the person looking at it or doing it. Similarly, like SEO or alt text, it's all just like kind of menial work that people end up having to do. And then that final level, just like creating a validation layer that's really, really robust on top of human validation, and then actually creating distributions. So say like publishing a piece, but then creating social assets that accompany it, creating like suggestions for social copy, stuff like that. This is all stuff that takes like a long time, but very few of those steps really add anything at all to the creative process that people actually value in journalism or piece of writing. It's just like a lot of unnecessary kind of surrounding labor and noise. Within that, in the central part of the platform, we do have like drafting, but that's totally down to an editorial team's discretion whether they decide to do something manually by like using an AI augmented writing tool, like where it'll challenge or like make suggest angles, or they just ask for a first run draft. Within that first run draft, we also have like a kind of grill me phase. So it'll be like the AI tool will come back and be like, what are you thinking for this story? What's your actual angle? What are you trying to focus on? There's this bit that was in the interview. There's this bit that's in the PDF document. Well, what's actually important to you? And it will go through like 7 or 8 steps of that. And then it will then kind of go away to form a more cohesive brief that you can look through. And then it will go through to a draft. And at that point, some of that content that I've gone through has been like kind of heartbreaking because I've like done that for a feature. I was like, okay, I'll try this like grill me process and I'll use all this information. I looked at the final version. I'm like, wow, I don't really know what I can do here because it's just like it took a long time to prompt it, maybe 20-30 minutes of like putting information, but when it came out it was like exactly what I'd expect, but in a way that was super neatly stitched together. And then it's like I can change a bit of wording here or there, but I'm not really adding anything. It's just customizing. But when you've added that level of information, the draft you'll get back is like super high quality. And that's probably what gets lost in the kind of like one shot slop kind of like AI writing world where you've got someone just being like, boom, here's a LinkedIn post that says nothing and means nothing, versus like here's a lot of information, here's a lot of context, and there's like a kind of iterative writing process. So yeah, we kind of do all that, and we do that for multiple types of content like news or features. And the idea is that you kind of give time back to the journalist to do something interesting, and that's kind of the key core principle. Like what is interesting is not whether you spent like 25 minutes writing a quarterly financial report or 2 hours in the morning looking through 1,000 sources to find out what was the most interesting bit of information in the morning in the kind of like, I don't know, like Canadian fishing beat. But I think there's like that stuff that doesn't really add, but the stuff that's interesting is going out into the world, speaking to people, actually looking at the whole topic and being like, I think the most interesting angle here is this from my lived experience, and actually adding something human to it. And I think we often think, okay, well, the human bit's in the writing, but like if it's totally formulaic programmatic writing anyway, someone isn't really adding their perspective. It's just a drain on time. So we have to be realistic about like, is that something someone should be doing? And I think ultimately that stuff people will be doing less in the future, whether that's because of AI or whether because that content just becomes less valuable because it didn't really take any effort to create. It's not scarce in any way. That's the kind of interesting question that I think is going to surface in the next few years. But I think journalism will have to get to a point where people do more interesting things with their time. They actually find, interesting stories. They have interesting conversations. They form interesting perspectives. And without that, I think there's no real like moat against, someone just churning out absolutely tons of content at scale, using an AI tool without kind of like any sort of high benchmark of, like verification interest or, journalistic ethics in it.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, maybe just people that have never kind of written as a professional activity just miss. Like how much reading is involved in publishing something. Like there's a lot of times that, like just now I'm writing about Apple's new foundation models framework. And like, I had to read 2 technical papers just now, like this morning. Like instead, like this blog post will be 800 words, but like it took me, it takes 45 minutes and to not read a technical paper takes a very long time to read, but like just kind of scan it and get the big picture idea. It's very, very, very time consuming. And, with a technical paper, I don't really trust just dropping in a ChatGPT, but like, there's a lot of stuff like an earnings report. Like I could spend 45 minutes reading this whole thing word for word. I could drop it in ChatGPT and say, I'm looking for these pieces of information. Like, tell me where to find them. and give me 3 anchor words that I could search for to go exactly to that point, and then skip all the questions that I don't care about. And it's just so much more efficient. And maybe I get to write 2 earnings analysis in a night instead of just 1, because I didn't have to read both earnings call transcripts word for word. And like, that's not AI generated output. There's nothing to do with actually generating the words. It's more about inform me and give me the latest information as fast as possible, so that then I can ingest that and then write my analysis, right? Like that's true. And then, find me new information that could add more context to my understanding of this topic. Like that is really underappreciated, because like, how do it's just unknown unknowns. Like, where do I even go to look? And if there's a tool that's just been, knows it's got a huge bank of resources that it can scan basically every 10 minutes to find stuff that's relevant to me, that's just helpful. That's all. It doesn't generate the output. It makes the writing process more efficient. And that really, I think, is the true advantage of using these tools, right?
Yeah, and that's it. And to like kind of visualize that a bit more clearly, that for us, that's like, we have in the platform, we have sort of an RSS and a web kind of scraping section. We have a social media section. We have a YouTube section, and that stuff's all this polled. It's great, like kind of like super frequently. So some stuff might originate from international press or a different press in a different sector. Might originate from a competitor, but a lot of it's just on social media that's happening. Like YouTube transcripts, like finding a very specific part of a long podcast that's actually really newsworthy or an interesting starting point. And yeah, that stuff that is just like genuinely impossible to do in like a personal level. But what's cool about the platform is that the journalist decides what the sources are. It's not just saying, hey, ChatGPT, find this interesting story. You're in charge of saying, no, I think these international outlets are really important. I'm going to over-index on them. I think these social accounts are the ones I really want to follow. These are the YouTube channels I want you to look at every single day and tell me what's coming up there. And that's where you get a bit more like originality and curation kind of put back into the process, compared to like, just the sort of a general sort of sweep of saying, Claude, tell me what's interesting.
All right. I know we're at time. Take this moment to promote the Velora platform. How can people test it out? How can they add it to their writing workflow?
Yeah. So we're just like Velora, VELORA.build. And I'm Peter Stuart on LinkedIn, Stuart. And you can just come and add me on LinkedIn, ask to use the platform. We let people use it. We're still kind of in the early phase. We want people to use it and feedback and tell us what they like or hate or think's really good. So yeah, just reach out, and I'm happy to do demos. And we're also happy to like work with people on their specific use cases, because we're just super fascinated in how this scales out to someone working in, say, fishing, or someone working in bird watching, or someone working in super specific insurance financial stuff. And so far we found that it's actually able to help people in almost all cases, because some of these tools just are kind of totally title or sector agnostic, which is really fun. So yeah, reach out to me, and please don't hesitate. I'm friendly and I'm always happy to have a chat. And even if you don't want to use the platform, just happy to have a chat about AI, my favorite topic, AI and journalism. So yeah, don't be a stranger.
Thank you, Peter.